Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Madoff. I'm the chair of the Masters in Curatorial Practice, and we're delighted because not only is it a great crowd, but this is our first event. The program opened about a month ago. It is the sole Masters in Curating, amazingly, in New York City, and we have our first group of students here who are coming from all over the world. And this space, which you're in, is meant to be a kind of curatorial laboratory, which will be for our students, but it will also host events like this that are open to the public, exhibitions, debates, panel discussions of different kinds. So Jovana has put together this super interesting evening, and welcome.
Oh, first test of intelligence, huh? Test of intelligence, how to get the mic. Oh. Well, welcome. Jovana, that would be me. I'm a deputy chair at Curatorial Practice. Is it on? Huh? Can you hear me? Woo, I have to project. Let me project. Well, we're delighted that you're here. So to cut this, niceties, I am delighted myself that I have this group of panelists, and please join us on the floor. Like sit down on the floor, make this into more, make it into a more informal space. We wanted this panel to be, addressing issues of contemporary curating and address the issue of critical positioning of curating in 2014 in New York. But we wanted also to have this kind of a, not really tongue-in-cheek, but a topic that would be sounding provocative at the same time we are working with the same kind of tropes that curators do when they play with titles, when they play with ideas, not only with artists and our art. So the title was Curators, right? Curators that surround me here. The Younger Than Jesus Effect. And I will try to not at the end of the panel say, oh, what was this effect? Let's sum it up. But really to open the discussion when we say, I invited young curators. So instead of calling it blandly young curators, I wanted to say they are younger than Jesus when Jesus died for our sins, right? So they still have a chance. They have a messianic role. They have a mission and messianic role to save the art, the eternal art. They are indeed extraordinarily interesting to me, and I commend their work to your attention and your critical judgment. But they are young, and so we wanted to start as I am telling you, tongue-in-cheek, but really to have a point here. We're starting from the specific marketing strategy when you have to have a provocative title, right? And Younger Than Jesus was a show that reverberates this notion of packing young artists for museum-going audience. And as you know, it happened in New Museum in 2009. So we start from there. But this discussion will not be only like assessing, the effects of one particular show, but will address issues of youth, novelty, commodification, and fetishization of these phenomena. And I wanted to start, I really have to, I don't want to read bios at length, but I just want to tell you why I chose each person that is on the panel. So it will be awkward. I'm talking and you're nodding and you're like, no, you did not get this, right? But I will welcome you, but I will read your bios when I invite you to speak. And I ask our lovely curators, younger than Jesus so far, or at the same age that Jesus is. My first question was are you younger than 33? And ladies were like, what kind of question is that? But when you're younger than 33, it's fine. And I can say that because they are also what you know, and that you are. I'm looking at the audience, Millennial Generation, and I have the benefit of not being of Millennial Generation, so I feel like I'm not part of that group. Without further ado, on my right is Rujeko, but next to her, this gentleman with Everitt Howe is invited here because I was looking at this particular voice of yours. You did, you're Brooklyn-based. You went to Columbia and got your MA, so you have credentials. You did interesting. He got an MA. It's very important. I'm saying that because we're talking about professionalization of the profession, and then you did interesting shows. So you're writing and doing shows, and your work with Participant is something that I'm interested in. Your work with Kitchen, your shows that are doing is something. Your photos when you do Google image are interesting. Image gallery, how you position yourself. And I wanted you to, to start and to present whatever you want, because first thing that we didn't know each other when I asked you to be in the panel, and you said, is this kind of generational curating? I curate people who are 90 years old. I am not a youth whisperer, or something like that. I don't know, am I quoting verbatim? But like you said, I have something against this, young people inviting to represent young artists. So I think that was the best thing that I could hear when we started thinking, and I'm inviting you now to what can you do in 10 minutes for us? Your work, your professional work so far. Thank you, David.
So I'm going a little bit off topic from the get-go, but what I wanted to say initially is that I think in the past I have tended to work with many young artists. I think for several reasons. I think because I was young. At Columbia, I knew a lot of MFA students, and they were also young, and I sort of met them. We became friendly, and as I became sort of open to doing shows, I wanted to help them as best I could. It became kind of an issue of proximity and convenience in a way. Also, I think I didn't have the budget to produce new works by very established or older artists. But I think that when we talk about youth obsession, I don't think it's just about youth. I think it's also about what institution is obligated, or responsibility for institution towards showing artists of any sort of age or race or sex. I think it's really, to me, what's interesting is actually the institution itself. And I want to tell a little bit of an anecdote, which is sort of, I think it's interesting personally. I think when we look at institutions and their obligations to show artists of diverse ranges, ages, sexes, what have you, the Whitney Biennial, which was just recently, is kind of an interesting point for me for that very reason of how an institution responds to certain criticisms or contexts. And if you don't know, Danelle Wolford was in the show along with the AMPS Collective. They kind of had, they sort of had issues with Danelle Wolford and who withdrew from the show. And I wanted to talk about Danelle Wolford because I actually curated her in a show of mine, and to me it's really personally interesting. I had a show at Abrams Art Center. It was a group show. I needed some more work for it. I was out at Anna Cristero Gallery. They were showing this painting show. The show is basically like painting that's not painting, And I was like, oh, interesting. So I go to this painting show, and there is a work of, it looks a lot like, well, there's an example. But it's like little wood pieces that are sort of like mashed together to form kind of like a pictorial shape of painting. And at this time, I was really, everyone at Columbia is talking about Michael Fried and art and objecthood. And it's like Michael Fried, like on and on and on and on and on. And I was like, oh my God, it's so Michael Fried. There's like a Gestalt, and it formed the shape of a painting. And I was like, just the Fried buttons were just like flying off the radar. And I was like, who is this artist I wanted in my show? So then I researched Danelle Wolford, and I was like, oh, she came from Atlanta. That's where I'm from. I'm also from Georgia. It's amazing. And then also, she was African American, and I was like, I need one for my show. This is perfect. It was like the perfect artist for me. And it ended up that actually it was totally not true. It was a middle-aged, straight, white male from Yale. So basically the art gods basically shat all over me for this show. So I thought about it, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to have this sort of problematic situation in the show. It wasn't really what I bargained for, but formally I liked the work a lot, so I basically just kept it in. But I bring this up because I thought what was interesting about the debate with the Whitney was that more than the sort of race of Joe Scanlon or more than the context of the specific artists involved, it was that the institution really wasn't listening to their concerns. There was really no dialogue or transparency to the process. And they even said this outright. It wasn't really anyone specifically, it was just the way that they were handled by the institution. So I feel like as curators, the idea of curatorial transparency to me is really interesting because I don't know how in practice that would work. If I had like a log of my decision making or what have you, I'm not really sure. But I think it really stuck with me because as I work as a curator and as I work at an institution, you have to ask yourself, why do I pick certain people? What are the reflexes of my decisions? Why is this person picked over another person? I work a lot with nonprofit spaces. One of them is Participant Inc., and it's an alternative space. And the notion of alternativity is really interesting because it's always changing. It's never static, right? What's alternative can change in 30 years. Look at performance art. It's now totally institutionalized. So the question is, what does it mean at any given time? And part of our mission also is to show an intergenerational, international mix of artists, young, old, black, white, queer, or otherwise, So I think it's really important to keep these questions in mind as a curator. I'm certainly not perfect, But if I had my druthers, when I curate the new museum show, it would be just people over 50 and only Adrian Piper. And that would be the biennial for me. My group shows just Adrian Piper. Anyway, so yes, to veer away from the topic of the panel, I think that youth is really important, but to me it's more of an institution's responsibility, and as a curator, your responsibility to cater to everyone involved at any given time, whatever their background is. And this was the rest of my slideshow. Voila. Wonderful. Amen.
I'll take this first.
Again, and Rojako is grabbing a computer to prepare these high-tech slides. Rujeko Hockley is assistant curator of contemporary art in Brooklyn Museum, and I learned about you because I read curators that you should know or something like that online. When they are following people on the rise on the internet, but why you're there because of that institutional responsibility or representation. And so I'm not inviting you because you're doing the big show that is representing Brooklyn living artists, but I'm inviting you as as your voice and your position within institution when you're dealing with contemporary practice and contemporary art making, and you will be talking about that. So you're not veering off the topic like some people.
I would never. Well, thank you for having us, Jovana, and this place is beautiful, SVA. Thank you for having us. So even though I'm not here necessarily to talk about this show that you've just mentioned, I am going to talk about it, only because we're installing right now, and that's what I've been doing all day, and what I did all day yesterday, and what I've been doing for the past 2 years, basically. But I think what I want to start with actually is this idea that you said, David, curatorial transparency. I think a lot about curatorial ethics, and I think those are kind of related terms that I'm not totally sure what they mean. But as far as Younger Than Jesus, I saw that show in 2009 before I went to grad school in San Diego, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great show, and the thing that has really stuck with me in the 5 years since then was the directory, and the way in which, so the directory was however many artists there were in the show, in the catalog that you could see. There was a directory of everybody else they visited or thought of who, for whatever reasons, you know, contingency, logistics, not the right work, who knows, sure they were all wonderful, nice people, were not in the show. And I think that record is in some ways even more interesting to me than even this idea of age as an organizing principle. That's kind of a tangent, but I'll just say that. So the age, it is an organizing principle, and as a curator, you need one, right? No matter what you do, no matter what your show is, there has to be something that holds it all together, ideally, right? Thank you. So in that case, that's what it was. I think maybe the downside or the corollary to that might be that when we have a show that's organized around, thank you, it's okay, around age, it also generally kind of tends to go hand in hand with this idea of emerging. So my thing is that you can be emerging at any age, and I think that my investment as a curator is in longevity of careers for artists and also for curators. So we're here as whatever age we are, but I think, I'll speak for myself, but I'm sure we would all like to be still doing this when we're 60. And I would like the artists that I work with to still be doing this when they're 60 or 90 or whatever age, if that's what they want to be doing. So longevity in careers, which for me allows you sustained focus, attention, time to develop, change, make bad decisions, do weird stuff that nobody likes, come back, do stuff that is weird that people do like, that you don't like, and I think what?
Or hate.
Or hate, whatever. Yeah, but that time is valuable, and I think for me the danger of a age-specific focus and not specific to the art world, obviously we live in a youth-obsessed culture, so let's not be too hard on ourselves, it's not just us. That's the downside. So having now kind of almost come out on the other side of this show, Crossing Brooklyn, that's opening at the Brooklyn Museum in about 2.5 weeks, which I'm co-curating with Eugenie Tsai. It's a show of 35 artists. That's who they are. 35 artists and collectives. And they range in age from the born in 1949 to born in 1984, with everything in between. A lot of people in the 70s. So a lot of people in their 40s, right? That's what the math is. Late 30s, early 40s. We did not set out to have any sort of age criteria. That's how it shook out. In the way that I think, as you all can probably relate, you do studio visits, you visit people, you see what's happening, you like something, you think about it more, you go back, you see something else that is similar or reminds you of that. And in that way, that's kind of how Eugenie and I built this show. It was a very organic process where we spent all last summer doing studio visits, and at a certain point we're like, well, these things feel good together, this feels like a show. And the thing that felt good together was a shared sensibility, a feeling of artists who were engaged with the world, who had an expansive practice, who were looking outside themselves, who didn't have a kind of hermetic practice. And not that there's anything wrong with that, obviously, but that was what we were interested in that moment, kind of also based on what was going on in the world around us. So this is what we ended up with. The rest of my slides are really just some pretty pictures, because we're in the pictures business, right? So I thought we should have some. Paul Ramirez-Jonas, Marie Laurent's on the left, Linda Goodbryant. That's a rendering, but let me just say that is not what you're gonna see. That was an early idea, I really like it. It's a rendering. I just have to say that because people get excited. There are vegetable gardens at the museum, but they are not there. They're on the sides. Nobutaka Ozaki, Cynthia Danyo, Gordon Hall, and Duke Riley. And this is kind of a random assortment of images I had on my desktop before I came here. So it is not to be chosen for any particular reason, though they do run the kind of spectrum of ages that I described. But yeah, that's kind of my piece. I do think that this idea of curatorial transparency and ethics is very interesting, especially in the experience of putting together a large group show, whereas I also started, like you, working with my friends who were my age. Some of these people are my friends who are my age, or approximately. Some of them are my friends who are older than me. Some of them are people I don't know at all. And how do you balance those differences? And also, how do you balance your responsibility to people and to their work? And for me, the Brooklyn Museum is an encyclopedic institution that has many, many curatorial departments. Like, I was just talking to our Egyptian curator last week, for, 33, younger than, he's literally talking about things from Jesus's time, like younger than Jesus. He's worked with mummies. So, I mean, I think my time scale is, though I'm in the contemporary art world, obviously, and work with living artists exclusively, my time scale has to operate within an institution that is almost 200 years old, that has collections that are over 2,000 years old. So, that is my piece.
Thank you, Rojako. And Chris, who does not have images, so we don't have to prepare. Chris Wiley, because you are an artist, and so we're not peddling your work. You're a writer and a curator, and I first met you when you curated a show towards the Warm Month, which is probably one of my most loved titles, or my loved titles that I loved for group shows that you did on Stellar Race. But you also are invited here because you worked for the museum in capacity of a very important capacity for curatorial work. You wrote the show. What does that mean? You wrote the labels, but you made voices for many shows that I visited, from Venice Biennial to Younger Than Jesus in New Museum. And I invited you not only to talk about that, how is it like, are you channeling curators, but I wanted to talk more about that discourse and you as an artist working within that. So if I invited you to talk about that, but then I said, like, you can talk about other aspects of this topic. So Chris.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yes, I did actually work on Younger Than Jesus as a curatorial advisor and writer for the catalog, editor of the reader that was attached to the catalog, as well as I was the sole writer of all the wall labels for that show. So I had a very intimate involvement with that show. I've worked on a number of other exhibits, as you said. I find it, I was thinking about this topic of what it means to be obsessed with youth today. And I look at the art world and the art world's current youth obsession, and it seems to me to be of like an entirely different character than the one that was at least ostensibly brought forward in Younger Than Jesus. Which is interesting because it's really only been, 5 years. I guess we can talk about that in terms of the tremendous force that the market has had in the past, really in the past decade, on shaping the way that art is looked at, is consumed, is thought to be of value, et cetera, et cetera. As has been sort of said before, Younger Than Jesus was actually like a very various and sort of wide-reaching show that gave the first major museum opportunities to a number of artists who have now become kind of household names. I think Ryan Trecarton had one of his first museum shows there. In that show, Elad Lassery, Liz Glynn, a couple of people who we all sort of know now. And also the artist directory was sort of a fantastic thing, which was which I don't think was entirely mentioned. It was like entirely open. But the way that it was sort of put together was it was entirely open source. We took submissions from all around the world and sort of picked. I actually don't even think it was edited. I think it was just everyone who submitted was in this book that was published by the New Museum. It was very egalitarian and wonderful. And a number of those artists who I wrote about for that book have now have careers of their own with major New York galleries. And it was a nice thing. Whereas now I feel like, of course, the show was structured to be about youth in a way that was kind of designed to be controversial. I mean, the name Younger Than Jesus was like an obvious jokey name. But you know, part of the curator's jobs is also to bring people through the door. And you know, that seemed to work. We also joked, actually it's funny that you brought that up about the show you wanted to curate of artists over 50. We were always joking that the next triennial would be older than Methuselah. Yeah, that didn't happen. But if you think about the way that art is sort of, has moved towards youth today, I think about sort of two things. One is, of course, the sort of much lamented rise of process-based abstract painting, which no discussion about this topic can possibly avoid at this point, whether fortunately or unfortunately. And then the other is the rise of a kind of global post-internet aesthetic, if we can sort of use that highly controversial and sort of very nebulous term. On the one hand, process-based abstraction, I think is...
By white males under 30.
Yes. You correctly point out process-based
By white
abstraction
males under
by
30.
by
Living
white
in New
males
York
under
City.
30, many of whom live in New York City. But you know, it's really become a global brand at this point. Is something that that now dominates the way that we think about youth. But I find very interesting, or the thing that I find very interesting, especially in this context, is there has been basically no institutional support for this work. I think that if anybody at this point mounted a show that was like the new Abstraction, they would be run out of town on a critical rail, and you know, and collectors still wouldn't care. And I think that is incredibly fascinating, is that this lens that is shifted towards youth is now one that is, that sort of like eye of Sauron is now being operated by collectors rather than curators who, you know, frankly, I don't know if I'm speaking for everybody here, but this trend in painting has now basically made it so that I think that like abstract painting of almost any kind has pretty much no currency, in my opinion. And then, so that's a polemical point. I'm going to make one more quick point about the interesting way that I see the quickening of artistic generations acting in post-internet art specifically, and the way that it sort of speaks to a manner in which young art is being produced, and through like circulation of images and a conversation that is now global and taking place over Instagram rather necessarily than like artistic communities of people hanging out at bars and whatnot, though it is also that. I think that there's a very interesting, I'm also maybe talking about artists that people don't know who they are, and I maybe should have brought images, but just to speak very broadly, I think that there's a very interesting shift that's taken place in work of artists who are making what could be broadly thought of as post-internet art, which is essentially art that materializes the aesthetics of the internet in physical space, let's say. In that the first generation of these artists were very interested in critically addressing the way in which technology affects our lives, particularly as it sort of relates to ideas of post-humanism and the singularity, and you know, messing with the human brain and human augmentation, that kind of thing. Now, the younger generation has basically taken on the aesthetic tropes of these earlier artists, who really are only like 2 or 3 years older than them, and have made it into a kind of like aesthetic pastiche of this previous work, in which the idea that, I don't know, if you're Josh Klein and you're putting a bunch of like interesting contemporary signifiers of contemporary life in a blender, like a euro mixed with some NyQuil, mixed with some printed out online porn, and you're making a kind of like Whole Foods shake out of it. That kind of collage of contemporary life is, to me, much more compelling and much more interesting than a kind of collage of contemporary life that you would find on a blog like The Jogging, in which they basically just take, like interesting charged signifiers and smash them together to make a thing that like is memeable. I'm thinking, for example, of drinks that they recently served at a party for Dis Magazine, which were basically served in Starbucks cups and held in crock cozies. Which is, you could say a lot about that, but is essentially meaningless. And this idea, basically what I'm saying, which I don't know if it really relates to this topic or not, is that I think that the younger generation, or something that can be said about the younger generation, is that there is a tendency to kind of reduce ideas to images.
Not so different than the process-based abstract painters.
Exactly. Sorry, thank you very much. That is exactly what I was getting at, process-based abstraction, which is essentially taking abstract expressionist or minimalist forms and voiding them of all content and making them essentially currency. I don't know if that was good enough, but I'm just gonna leave it at that. That was my rant. That's what I prepared.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this rant. We'll get back to it. We'll get to the bottom of it. But I want to ask Alaina Claire Feldman to give her. I talked to Elena, who is here also, as your institutional role is being a director of exhibition at the Independent Curators International. But you're, apart from working with an institution, you are working on your own exhibitions, and this is, where I kind of figure it out what your curatorial stand is. But we wanted to cover these issues, and since we started talking, I think that we address specifically, you and I, but everybody else, what does it mean critical curating today, and not today, but in how we address this specific issue of criticality. We don't have image. Let me figure it out. Thank you.
I wanted to just respond to Chris real quick. One thing that you said that really, that I often think about is kind of artists who just reference and circle on the very tail end of contemporary art. And I think one thing that I really try to do in my practice is look for kind of the blind spots in curating and in art history as well, and trying to kind of unearth practices that have been overlooked, not just focusing on the contemporary. When Jovana kind of invited me to speak here, I thought about the parameters of curating based on age limit, and that actually didn't interest me so much as thinking about kind of artistic, generational consciousness, and thinking about what artists are doing that frames the moment, and how curatorial practices can kind of frame this, and how artists and curators kind of work together and are very much involved in the same kind of scenes. And so in thinking about kind of my practice and what I do as a curator, I try to kind of frame my practice and things that I've done based on moments in history that have really influenced myself in New York City and my peers. And so this first slide is actually of Michelle Bernstein. I studied art history here in New York, and I was taking a class on Guy Debord, and actually I realized that I was much more interested in his partner, Michelle Bernstein, and I didn't speak any French at the time, so it was also really hard for me to understand what was happening. But I heard that a group of artists were translating her first book, which is this one, in downtown New York, and the group of the artists was called Rena Spallings, and it actually wasn't, it was a gallery named Rena Spallings. It still exists, but it was put together by a collective called the Bernadette Corporation. And so I found out that, I don't even remember how I found out that these translations were being made, but I went there and I showed up, and I thought that this space was so interesting and so unlike anything that I had seen. And this was in 2004 when they had a space on Grand Street, and this is a show of Seth Price's from 2004. And I kind of just said to them, oh, can I be a part of this? Like, so naive, just, walking into a space, being interested and kind of wanting to be part of the conversation. So they said, yeah, we don't have any like hired employees, but you can be our first. And so this is what happened. I kind of immediately fell into this space that was kind of not a real exhibition space, not a real gallery, but more an artist project. And so right afterwards was the financial crash in 2008, and I had graduated and I could not find a job. And so it really affected everyone around me. And I remember I was talking to so many artists, and we were so excited about the financial crash because we thought this is an opportunity to rethink the way that we work together and to rethink maybe the market, and maybe there'll be less of a focus on economics and we can start working and thinking through other things. And so I thought that was wonderful. But then I also decided that I would move to France to continue my studies because it was free. And I had a job set up there, which was really great, and that was through the gallery Rena Spallings at the very beginning of this magazine, May, that was being produced. And the title May is like May 68, which, is a very historical moment. So it was attractive to me for many reasons. A lot of the artists that they focused with, right here on the lower half is Michel Kreber, and it was kind of this new thing that I felt I had been prepared for in my studies, but it was also an opportunity for me to learn French and to do it really cheap. And May is an amazing project, and I got to work very closely with an amazing editorial board of people, like the artist Claire Fontaine, like the people that run this space, Castillo Corrales, Thomas Buteau, and Benjamin Thorel, with Eva Svenning, who's also a curator in France. And while I was there, I also had a lot of free time, so I decided to read up on my French feminist history. And these three women are pretty notorious for kind of leading écriture féminine, feminist writing from France. And the book in the middle is by Carla Lonzi, Let's Spit on Hegel. And that's actually a book that we translated a couple essays for the magazine. And I wanted to just talk about this because there's this history, again, that I'm trying to follow up with and trying to understand. It's a little green, but I think that's okay. So here's a screenshot of Chantal Akerman, and the first essay that I ever wrote and was published was on Chantal Akerman in Paris. It was really amazing to think about the histories that I was reading and the theory that I was reading and finding it very applicable. And then this is an image from the early days at the Centre Simone de Beauvoir in Paris, which is a very, very small space that I'll show you I continued to work with. It was founded in the late 70s by the actress Delphine Seyrig, who's friends with Chantal Akerman, I can go on forever. But it's an audiovisual center that has training programs and also produces films, and it's like EAI or video database, so they also distribute films. So this was my time in Paris. I was really kind of getting interested in this history, but then I was broke in Paris again, so I moved back to New York, and I got a job where I am now the director of exhibitions at Independent Curators International. And I think that Renaud Proche, who's the executive director, came to speak with a couple of the students the other day. So those of you who don't know, ICI is a nonprofit organization based in New York, and the exhibitions we do, along with, I'm also in charge of publications, are traveling exhibitions. So we'll produce a show, produce an exhibition, but also produce a project in a way that a traditional museum can't, and kind of give curators and institutions around the world, and I mean everywhere. We just did a show in Kosovo, raw material for kind of creating a project in which they can kind of tweak to their local context, because it's the idea of kind of creating a shared understanding of various practices around the world. And so I worked on some amazing projects, and I continue to. And this is Martha Wilson, a Documenta 5 show, A State of Mind, California Conceptual Art from the 60s and 70s. And then Occupy Wall Street happened, and all of my friends decided to get in the street and to, galleries were opening up their doors, not, galleries in Chelsea, but galleries like Rena Spallings, spaces like Artist Space, Real Fine Arts in Brooklyn, to make signs. And so artists were coming and getting really weird and making protest signs together. And I won't name names, but I will say that that's Ken Okishi, who is in the Whitney Biennial. So you really have artists that are being shown in a kind of in institutions who are also in the street kind of protesting. And this really continued to affect how I thought about working in and out of an institution. And so I went back to the Center Simone de Beauvoir. Tell me if this is too long, Jovana. And I worked to translate 7 films from the center that had never been translated before from French to English. And this was also leading back to kind of my history and frustration of not understanding varying, European histories because of language barriers. So I translated these 7 films. I showed them at the kitchen for 2 nights and had 2-day symposiums with people like Martha Wilson, younger artists like Kate Hardy and Georgia Sagri. Kate Millett, the amazing, feminist writer, came to speak as well, and it was such a huge success that afterwards the translations were used to translate the films in Mexican. I mean, oh my God, in Mexico, in Spanish. So it's just kind of this idea of, again, continuing to think of how the limits of what an artwork can be, and kind of like how the potential of curating can kind of expand a new audience. And so then Sandy happened, and there was, it was just so disastrous in Lower Manhattan, which is where I live. But it also was this amazing brief moment. So here you have this horrible disaster of a building in Chelsea kind of just fallen, the whole facade. But then this kind of interesting image of people coming together to charge their cell phones, and they kind of made this makeshift technology, and people kind of just coming together. You see this guy's even giving thumbs up. But it was really interesting for me to think about how there was this brief moment where we had to like kind of stop ourselves, and we had no way to communicate beyond like, traditional social relations of talking to people face to face and leaving notes at our neighbors' apartments, making sure everyone was okay, and not relying on the internet or technology or phone at all. And so I curated this show right after at a space on the Bowery. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a show called, Starlight in the Credit System. And it was a video art project that was by Melanie Gilligan and Frances Scholes and Mark von Schlegel, and both these films were about ways that professionalization in the art world is kind of perpetuated, and how how this is market driven. And so I kind of interweaved these episodes to kind of talk also about rhythms and the kind of rhythm of a video, and how maybe solutions aren't solved in 30 minutes, how we think they are presented to us on television. And also to kind of play with the idea of what a professional artist is and isn't. And then I curated this project at the space called Cage with Magnus Schaefer, and it's a project that I think we're kind of continuing to work on. And it's called Unofficial, and it's about Andy Warhol's unofficial superstars, and just finding videos, like ubiquitous videos on YouTube and Vimeo. And this one was of Taylor Mead. And so we kind of just showed these kind of impersonal, unofficial, really kind of renegade videos that were just circling around the world about these people who kind of wanted to position themselves as such superstars. And so to kind of think it through the ideas of fame through these videos. And then I continued to work at ICI, and now I'm working on publications, lectures, and things like that as well. And the top is Stephen Vittiello and Alvin Lucia for a project that I curated at Anthology Film Archives about avant-garde composers in New York in the 60s and 70s. And actually one of the films we showed was made in the 60s by this producer, Michael Blackwood. And we had never met before, and we were corresponding. And when I first met him, he said, "Oh, I thought you were Elena's intern." And I think this was definitely like because of my age. So I thought that was kind of an interesting anecdote. And then just recently, I curated a show again with the Center Simone de Beauvoir, and I worked with this amazing, also nonprofit called Electra, and it was pretty similar videos about these kind of radical, avant-garde practices of making video militant, feminist, kind of activist structures and kind of documenting them. And this was called Chercher la Femme. And I can't even tell you what it's about because I don't have enough time. And then right now, I'm working with the class of Frances Scholz, who's a painter in Braunschweig University in Germany. And I'm a student in her MFA program. Unofficially, I'm working with the students to kind of think about ways that students and curators can work together, and curators and artists can work together. And it's very kind of, I have no idea what we're doing. We kind of went into it really blind, but the idea is really just to think of new ways to work together and new forms of discourse between young curators and young artists. And right now, I'm also working on my first institutional show for the institution that I work for, Independent Curators International, and it's going to be a traveling show about the alternative art space, Fashion Moda, in the South Bronx, and it's kind of about artistic practices that happen outside and inside the studio in a time when spatial, political issues were very kind of hot in New York City, and how kind of graffiti and hip-hop kind of was perpetuated by the market, but also offered an entirely different new platform for thinking about culture in the South Bronx at this time.
Jenny Jaskey is a curator and the director of Artist Institute at Hunter College. And Jenny, I visited Jenny's project when she was working with, as you know, and maybe you don't know, but you will visit. Artist Institute is dedicated to work of one artist for a semester, and not only that artist, but it's around the artist's work. And I visited Jenny's exhibitions and programming around Pierre Huyghe, and artists who Jenny worked with are not millennial artists, and certainly not the, what did we say, processual abstract artists of a white male younger than 30. On the contrary, when you look at the list of artists that Jenny worked at, they don't have anything to do with these trends, but they deserve the attention the Institute is putting into them. So this was this is our platform. You're not doing like millennial artists. What are you like? And how you include artists and how you include this notion of contemporaneity. I think it's crucial for my wanting to talk to you. So thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So 52. Since we're ostensibly talking about youth, which we could also describe as our world's obsession with the new, which I think people have talked about, I thought I would start with that number and its relevance for my curatorial practice. I wondered actually if I had ever worked with anyone in the last 3 years who was younger than Jesus and thus younger than me. And other than some group shows or one-off performances, actually no one I've worked with is younger than Jesus. And then I thought, I wonder what the average age is. And then I did that, and also it's the median age. 52 is the magic number, which leads me to announce my next curatorial project. So I bring up age mostly because I think it's a red herring, which I think others have said. And if we want to talk about the art and ideas of our time, then we need to consider time more carefully. And that's from Agamben. And so this is a work by Pierre Huyghe, who I've worked with this year. It's called Timekeeper. And I think it poses the same question as Agamben. Pierre considers this work a group show, and he rubs down the wall of the museum in a gesture that's as much geologic as it is artistic. And so it's a keeper of time that's both of our time and out of our time, which leads us back to Agamben. Those who are truly contemporary, who truly belong to their time, are those who neither perfectly coincide with it nor adjust themselves to its demands. They are thus, in this sense, irrelevant. But precisely because of this condition, precisely through this disconnection and this anachronism, they are more capable than others of perceiving and grasping their own time. So since we're thinking about youth, an image of youth. So for those of you who attended a Montessori school, which my brother did, you may recognize this picture. So birthdays at Montessori become the occasion for astronomy lessons. To demonstrate the rotation and revolution of the planets, and thus the passage of time, each child is asked to spin in circles and to walk around the little model sun the number of years they've been alive. And we could think of this little ritual as a celebration not of youth, but of the horizon and of the return. And so when I think of my own curatorial methodology and its relation to the now, I'm interested in horizons, in the artistic, and that the artistic landscape is always changing, but it isn't going forward. It's going around, like a child, in circles. In this way, we may find that the best questions, the ones that lead us to the next horizon line of questions, come from another time. And they may come from artists born before 1962 or 1835, after 1989, maybe. And presently, I think there's a lot to be learned from the late 19th century philosophy, early 1970s performance art, and late 1960s labor activism. And so I guess what I wanted to say from my piece tonight is that we ought to be paying attention to art and following its most pressing questions where it leads. And we can't afford to get distracted by the demands of our time. And this is something that another artist, David Horvitz, has done, referencing Bajanader, another artist from another time. And this is a lot about how I think about how I'm going to meet an artwork and an artist. So I wanted to reframe the discussion a bit like David, and away from implicitly glorifying youth through its negation even, to our various and perhaps millennial curatorial horizons. And so I guess I wanted, and I think many of the other curators here have begun to answer these questions. What are our priorities, and how do they fail to meet the demands of our time?
We want to thank you.
Because it's so cute.
But this did not happen in the gallery.
This was a birth of the Artist Institute this year. This was a little baby. It was our first baby of the Artist Institute for Pierre Week. It was a private event that I witnessed this happen. There was a baby born.
But was it curated event?
The caring for of the curator in this case was keeping the incubator going for 6 weeks.
That's very important role of curator. And let's go back to responsibilities.
Okay, let's go back to the question.
To responsibilities of a curator, right? And this is when you said, like, I want to reframe the discussion, and I thank you for saying that. We lost the questions because, like, it's not reframing our previous question. You know, we are kind of positing things, but I wanted to ask, you know, within this frame of curatorial responsibilities, criticality, or priorities, I wanted to, to throw the first question at you, and then you can throw it back, or reject it completely. If we, I was reading then, what's that priority and responsibility in creating an exhibition, working with artists? Is it like a prognosis, with youth obsessed or novelty obsessed, or is it diagnosis? As Envezor recently, was asked, what's the exhibition doing? He said, it's be aware of the world that gives birth to art. Be aware of the world. It does not mean that you are, perpetuating status quo, but birthing art or birthing living creature here maybe has something to do one with the other. We were joking about the eternal art, but what is the diagnosis of the world that Elena, you mentioned, just in passing, these throwing these bombs of recession or catastrophe or marginalized presence of art making. So I just wanted to read that this is a quote. So this is the world that we are responding to. Mapped hyperlinks, digital indexes, data mines, image recognition, sexual screen personas, celebritized politics, pharmaceutical, demodification, genetic engineering, drone technology, satellite weaponization, preemptive policing, extraordinary rendition, extrajudicial incarceration, conformity, consensus, multinational corporation, and so on. So is this the world that we are responding as curators within institutions? And I want to throw it back to the institutional frame of curatorial priorities, you know, that like we are talking about. Are we aware of the world, or we are like just positing in diagnosis, or what curators are doing, like in terms of, you know, giving birth to, you know, to living creature as art? So, like, how about that, David?
Well, I wanted to jump in because I wrote about these two artists collaboratives who had a show at the Kitchen recently, and for some reason, Jenny, your talk about time really brought into fore about like how you measure time, how you queer time, and anti-timeline. And Gerard and Kelly did this show at the Kitchen, which was really powerful to me because I feel like they took these ideas from Deleuze of line of flight movement, the WASP, you know, that sort of doesn't differentiate between genders, about this idea of a couple and coupling and decoupling. And they hired pairs of people to walk in a circle in a space, and it was, you know, it could be like two boyfriends or a mother and a sister or two twins, and then to start from the present and then go back through time and recall moments in their shared lives, cultural moments and cultural touchstones, right? So they would go in a circle and it would be, oh, you know, someone walked in with a red sweater, and I forget the exact terminology, but it was like before whatever, and it would go back through time, and they would, you know, with the mother and the daughter, it was really amazing because she would be like, you know, when you were 12, you fell on their bike, and then before that, I divorced my husband, and before that, there was Watergate, and then you were born. It's this amazing, like, progression of time that really kind of, for me, it was almost so universal and so, I don't know, we could all kind of play into it in a way that I find very rare in contemporary art, and it's kind of like my personal ideal is to find work that operates on many different levels. And speaking of time, speaking of shared experience, it was one of the most powerful shows I had seen for the way it could queer our notions of our relationships, you know, how we bond together, our time together, and in a culture, you know, in our lives, basically. For some reason, it really just like, that clicked when you were talking about time in your presentation. And it also dovetailed with how the kind of work that I would want to present, one that operates in many different levels between people, you know, in a really like idealistic or naive way. I don't know.
I think I just wanted, the thing that, oh no, I like this one better, thank you. The thing that really strikes me, and Jovana, perhaps I'm assuming this is not an accident, is I think that it's been very interesting to hear. I think we have some very clear points of commonality around this question, and even around, as you say, like where we are right now in the world, and those touchstones of Hurricane Sandy, of Occupy, of all of these moments we've all kind of lived through in the last, you know, decade, or 5 years more realistically, and what they have produced both in curators and artists, but also in the world at large. But the thing that really is so interesting to me is this process-based abstract painting and the lack of institutional support for it, which is absolutely true, and yet it is ubiquitous. And for myself as a curator, in terms of when I think about my responsibilities to the contemporary, I'm thinking almost sometimes about my responsibilities to myself, and to be honest about what I'm interested in and not have to do things I'm not interested in. However, it's kind of an impossible thing when you're faced with the market and the money and all of that, and this huge kind of overbearing focus on things that you kind of don't care about. I don't know, but I think about all of those things a lot, and those tensions.
So, I mean, in that regard, I think that, my presentation, such as it was a little bit gloom and doom, but in sort of a tangential response to your question, I think that the job of a good curator is to create context for work, And one of the things that I was sort of railing against in my little rant was the fact that this work is in fact contextless. And I think that this is part of the reason why curators don't respond to it, because how do you contextualize the contextless? Unless you're doing it in a kind of negative way. In response to your question about, should exhibitions sort of speak about the world in this way, I would say provisionally yes, because the world is a place where we live and there are a lot of like interesting things about it. But I think that the primary onus of the curator is to tell a story about art. And within that, to allow the artists to tell their own stories. And if those stories happen to be about the world in this very pointed, political, and engaged fashion, then so be it. But I think that there is perhaps too much curatorial emphasis on a kind of maybe like heavy-handed approach to using the artist as a tool to speak about the world, rather than letting the artists speak about the world themselves.
Just a note on that, about some things that you see as possibly like negative turns in curating. Just wanted to add that one thing that I would say to people starting to curate now is that you shouldn't come up with a theme and then try to fit artists into your theme. That's like the worst thing ever. And the second worst thing that I see is these kind of male 30 and under abstract painting pieces, is that there's just absolutely like no regard for history, and like people thinking that they're operating in isolation and that they're not, and that there's a world out there, and you live in New York City with like amazing art spaces, amazing group of people, and there's so many amazing platforms, and you just kind of have to get in touch with them somehow, ask if you can intern or have a job. That's what I did. And try to kind of like recognize that you're not working in isolation, and that there is a huge, very, very long history, art history behind you, and it's essentially the history of the world. So that's just what I want to say.
We don't want to talk only amongst ourselves and to pat ourselves on the shoulder how righteous we are and critical and self-critical, critic and self-critic. I really want this, like we can only prove if we hear from the audience. So like it's not just a gesture. We really expect questions now. This is why we are here.
Hi, I have a question. I was wondering whether anyone has anything good to say about age as an organizing principle. It seems like, it's been referred to as kind of like a salacious title to get people through the door, or an organizing principle that could be just as good or bad as any other one. But I think it, as evidenced, I think, by the turnout at the new museum, and probably even the turnout here to some degree, it must be more powerful than that, and it must be more than kind of just like a reflection of a youth-obsessed culture. So I was just wondering if anyone has any insight into, why is this such a powerful organizing feature for curation?
No one thinks it is.
Is that true?
What'd you say?
Do it?
I mean, I would say that it might be provisionally only in so much as if we're talking about age as an organizing principle as a way to speak about an age, like a generation, an age, a period in time. And I think that perhaps in looking at artists of a certain generation, a certain sort of, of like an age group, you can mine perhaps unique perspectives on the world that have sort of arisen during those generations. I would say that is a compelling reason why one would focus on age as a curating principle. I think that vaguely Younger Than Jesus tried to do that, though we sort of extensively acknowledge the fact that it is very, very difficult to actually make a compendious statement about any generation. But I think the question that's maybe before us now is are artists of the generation that we're speaking making work that speaks to the state of the world in a sort of like way that is relevant? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would say at least some of the people that I've brought up, I would say maybe no. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, other than Chris, thanks for the shout out with jogging, if you guys could each mention maybe somebody, one of you guys on the panel, that artists under 30 that you do like, since we spent the whole time talking about artists over the age of 30. Anyone?
This is what curators become trendsetters, you know, like
Yeah,
like
I think
a
that's
list
exactly
of your
what we're
like.
here not to talk about. I mean, it's not that, for personally, like, oh, thanks. I would say that, you know, 75% of my friends are artists about my age. And it's not that there's any lack of respect for what they're doing, but I'm not here kind of to speak about, to perpetuate any kind of trends or any kind of market. And so I actually don't want to say. I kind of refuse that question. Yeah, I don't know.
Like and let's talk about Chris Wiley, who is also a young artist.
That's not fair at all.
I mean, I don't want to sound negative. I certainly don't want to sound like blanketly negative,
No, but
particularly
like-
as I am an artist who is, well, I'm as old as Jesus, so I'm like pretty much out the door at this point. And actually tangentially from that, you were saying that you were asked if you were an intern. I think the most pointed question that an artist can get nowadays from a collector is, how old are you? Because dollar signs just are all over the place. But Lauren, sorry about using the jogging as a bad example. I do still like the jogging, and certain artists who associated with jogging, who I will not name. But yes, there are tons of artists under the age of 33 who I think deserve a tremendous amount of attention and who are making like incredibly interesting work. I don't really want to be the biased person who like names those names. I think the point that maybe I was making is the attention economy that we live in now, that is sort of like a feature of the internet, is something that has allowed a privileged status to those who yell the loudest, and I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing.
I was wondering, you know, we're talking a lot about how young artists these days are more or less capitulating to the marketplace, that they tend to imitate these sort of tired, sort of zombie, dead abstraction modes and, you know, previous sort of internet art. Are young curators now a more resistant class? Are they a more sort of revolutionary class than young artists?
Oh, I don't want to say that young artists are not revolutionary. I mean, I think we are talking about negative examples. And I certainly don't feel I could speak for my generation of curators. But I think people are doing interesting things at all ages and whose contemporaneity kind of is changing all the time. And what's interesting is tracking those changes. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe the trends that you see among younger curators?
Oh, but
how they're
now
different
you're
from-
asking for the same thing. All of you came.
Just wondering what young artists are.
Yeah. I think, okay, but let me answer to why I don't want to answer that question. Because I think what that does is it assumes that curators that my role is to kind of go out there and be a trendsetter or aggregator, finder of cool things for people. And maybe there are curators for whom that's their role, or they've created an online platform with images daily that you can look at. But like probably many people who work actually in other fields of academia, I would hope that all of us are working from a methodology and that we have other long-term goals for ourselves as thinkers that we're working through with the artists that we choose to work with, and institutional questions that I want to work out like in real time and figure out precisely how to answer a question like institutional transparency. What does that mean for the Artists Institute? How am I going to think about paying the people that work there, and how am I going to think about raising support for us in a way that is more equitable to artists everywhere, or all kinds of things. And so I think great curators, like the ones that I really respect and look up to, that are mentors in a way, even if only like in reading their texts, are really working out of a bigger idea. And that's what I was trying to say in terms of those horizon kind of questions. And I think great artists are working in the same way.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I don't feel like I'm asking that question. I feel like in a way the conversation we're having shows the crushing weight that the market's having on all of these issues, that we're so self-conscious about basically not entering into a space that's been emptied out, that, you know, in a way we have to craft our language very differently. But I mean, you know, we should be able to still talk. 10 years ago, I think it wouldn't be too hard to talk about how curation seemed to be changing a little bit, and what sort of you know, different types of thoughts artists were having. Now it's almost a question that you know, it very quickly dips you in vacuousness, you know, if it's not handled well.
Well, I would like to talk about a little bit about curatorial degree programs. Hello. You know, I don't think any form of formal training in an educational environment can really equip you to be a quote-unquote good curator, right? Like, you really can't learn curating, I would say, at a higher institution. It's really more about taking the tools you learn art historically, through meeting artists, working with artists, and then going out into the field, trying to do what you want to do, failing, taking risks. And to me, that is the mark of a good curator, more than anything else. And I don't think that, you know, in the past, I think Columbia's program began in '96, and then Bard's before that, but I feel like there is a sort of professionalization of curating that I'm very skeptical of, and I don't know, I'm not saying it's not beneficial, because I went through one, but I feel like it's really a matter of, I think, meeting artists, working with them, taking chances, and getting your hands dirty, basically.
I absolutely agree, but I do think that the point that you've raised about the chasm over which we don't wish to fall, which is the conversation about the market and how that enters into curating, especially when you are a curator in a nonprofit setting, which we all are. It's I don't know if 10 years ago if it felt the same way, because I was in school. I wasn't a professional curator at the time, and I think you're totally right about the way in which you become a curator. It is a practical thing in a lot of ways, and methodology, absolutely, which is what the thing that you learn at school. But I struggle with that all the time, and I think about it all the time, and it feels weird to not talk about it a little bit to me. It feels weird to be on a panel, which I'm absolutely loving, people who are very interesting and saying things that are feel very meaningful that I agree with, but I'm also, a part of me over here is like, well, we all kind of think the same thing. The people who don't think that aren't here. The people who drive the youth-oriented kind of attention, which is very much market-driven, aren't here because they kind of don't care. And I don't mean that in a downer way, but I mean like, what is our responsibility as curators to artists, because that's where I feel my responsibility lies most absolutely, is to be led by artists, to listen to artists, to try and help them do the things they want to do to the best of my ability and the best of their ability. But what do we do with that other reality?
I just wanted to add one thing. I pulled a couple of numbers before I came. And it's actually really interesting because there's a lot of very well-known curators who started, 23 seems to be the number, and I think this also has to do with this kind of infrastructure of professionalization in the field and how maybe it takes more time and things are done obviously much differently than they were before. But for example, Gertrude Stein started collecting when she was 30, which, okay, that's, 30, it's closer to when Jesus died. Caspar Koenig, when he was 23, he curated his first museum show on Oldenburg. Walter Hopps was 23 when he organized his first exhibition
I feel really
on the
old.
Santa Monica Pier. Yeah, you feel old, right? Claire Sue, she was 23 when she founded the Asia Art Archive, and she's now the executive director. And Harold Zeman was 24 when he began curating exhibitions, but he was 28 when he became the curator and director of Kunstsaal Bern. So I just wanted to think about the history of curating, which actually is pretty short. It's not such a long history as the history of art history, and to think about the ways age and professionalization has kind of changed. And maybe we're old now. I don't know. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing to look at.
I can speak loudly. With those numbers, I'm curious though if there could be a conversation about privilege and access. Because
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think also a conversation about longevity. I think the fact that people who we know and respect who've had such interesting careers started that young and sustained it over 40 or more years is amazing, and something that I think we all, fingers crossed, aspire to.
And there still might be curators, that are directors of museums that are 23 now, and they maybe because of privilege, we're able to kind of circumvent an entire education system or, lack of peer group even. And those might not be the people that I am looking to or that I particularly am interested in.
But I wonder if, this is just a sort of idle question of I wonder if, because most of the people that you were talking about came of age in, I would say the 1960s or so. Has it changed now? Do we see, sort of stellar curators who are 23 running institutions? I don't know if we do. I mean, yes. Present accepted. But is it something that has now become harder and harder because of that very professionalization and because of the kind of I would say a crushing student debt that a lot of younger people who are trying to get into the curatorial field are sort of put down under the fact that if you're a curator, one of the ways I guess you make money, and I and other people on this panel make money, is by writing, and the fact that writing is now no longer a profession in which you can really make a living. I don't know, is that fair to say?
Yes.
Just about, yes.
Especially if you're a critical writer.
Right, and I think that shift in the landscape is something that, I don't know, can speak to those numbers that you brought up.
Hi. So I was wondering, do you see a place for curators, emerging or established curators, to be working with young artists, either mentoring or offering advice publicly, or should that only be in private, kind of? Because I think that there's a shared concern of what is relevant to society today, how do we want to change things? And I think that's shared among young artists making art and curators. And so do you see that as a point that both can come together on? And is there a public place for that interaction to take place?
Well, what do you mean publicly, exactly?
I don't know. I mean, exhibitions would be an obvious example, but it seems like there's been a lot of disinterest in emerging or established curators working with young artists. At least from the panel tonight.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I think we definitely, we're not here to pillory young artists per se. It's just that it's only one aspect of who we work with on a whole. It's not like
it wouldn't ever be the organizing principle. I think
Yeah.
that's the point. And why not?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that I think that in some ways the curator's job is as an advocate. And a supporter of work and a nurturer of work. I mean, I think about, whatever you think of his work, Maurizio Catalan's relationship with the person who turned out to be my curatorial mentor, Massimiliano Gioni. I mean, they had an incredibly close and, essentially collaborative relationship that served to establish both of them. And I think that that's a big part of finding a curatorial voice, is who are you going to advocate for and what are you going to put forward? I've now been put in this position just because I work as an artist with photography to curate shows in which I advocate for photographers who are also my peers, hopefully in an articulate and interesting way. But yeah, I think that's absolutely an essential role of a curator.
And my kind of side follow-up to this question of types of programs, curatorial practice, my shout out is to programs like Hunter and SVA, and where I went to school, UCSD and Bard, where there's an MFA and an art history program within the same institution. Because I do think that one of the things that has been so important to me was learning about art history at a graduate level with artists, because I felt accountable to them, and I still feel accountable to them, and I think it's extremely important as a curator of contemporary art to feel that accountability, and it's art historical accountability, but it's also sometimes personal accountability, and compassion, which can take many forms, sometimes hard compassion. No, but I mean, I do really, that is really, I think, a very important thing in terms of professionalization and pedagogy and how curators become curators and how artists become artists, and this idea of relationships between artists and curators is very, very important to me personally and has been very fulfilling to me personally, but I think on a bigger picture level about what kind of curators we want to be, what kind of artists we want to be, what kind of institutions we want to have, I think that is a very important thing to note and to support, because not all MFA programs are like that. Not all PhD and art history programs are like that. Many of them couldn't care less. And this is not one of them, so that's great.
Hi, thank you so much for a thought-provoking sort of field report. I have a question about the new generation of curators who came of age after this figure, symbolic figure of global curator became such a prominent phenomenon. So I'm just thinking late 1990s, especially 2000, and the proliferation of, I guess, certificate-driven curatorial, practice-based or theory-based programs, whether it's for a year or two or even for like a summer, just across the globe. And I feel like we can be cynical and criticize that there is a market for producing curators, but at the same time, something that you mentioned, that there was a gap in education system to produce good curators. So then when you establish a curatorial program, I'm just thinking that what kind of existing resources are you bringing from the existing structure of higher ed institutions, and what new are you adding? Is that kind of clear? When we're thinking about educating curators, what are you bringing from the existing resources that exist in educational institution, and what are you adding new to make a successful program?
I guess this is a question oriented to a new program here. Well, wonderful, because like Rujeko gave me, you know, a nice start, because we can be proud that we are part of SVA, that is like in its DNA an art school. And like when we planned the program, we wanted a program that it's not what we said, like you know, using artists. But when I say compassion, then like really, how do you serve art, and how do you serve artists, and how you're loyal to artists when you understand artists. So being within art school, our students are going to, you know, to think about curriculum specifically, are going to and are taking art classes. Are taking art classes not to be there to judge other artists, but like to see how difficult that is. So we are kind of very much engaged in that idea of like, you know, because that's a compassion, like to understand how difficult it is. But it also like, you wanted to say something? You wanted to say something?
I'm an advocate for curatorial programs being an MFA program.
Being an MFA program, but if
That's where it is.
Right. Okay. So like this is something that we do believe where strength of curatorial understanding lies, and building that loyalty, so it's not only on the level of making that as a statement. So for example, this is one part of it. But for the rest of it, please look at our statement and then look at our program, what we are trying to achieve in trying not to be, on the contrary, not being cynical, but contribute to the professionalization of the field. So thank you for that question, and thank you for letting me advertise our strength in our new space, and building discursive spaces and being able to to open the dialogue is something that we are particularly proud of. And are we dismantling the space? I don't know how this happened, but this is something that we do believe strongly is part of education, is kind of opening of discursive practice.
Hi.
We have one more question.
I have a question that, in terms of the responsibility or the focus, is there any difference between the nonprofit curator and the for-profit gallery curator? Is there any difference, or what are the differences? Thank you.
No, but there should be a difference. And I tell you, I go to some nonprofits, and I might as well be in a gallery in Chelsea or in the Lower East Side. Really. And then they've sold the whole show of the artist. And I guess the gallery has made the money and not the nonprofit who's paid for the production. I find this to be really pervasive here in New York City. And I think that as nonprofits, we should be thinking about what kinds of contexts we can offer artists at every level, at the level of what we program, but also how we fund it, and who our constituents are, and who our audience is. And we must be different than the objective of a commercial gallery, really different.
Well, it should be structural, right?
It should be structural, but also curatorially, it should offer the artist something different. I mean, you could criticize the Artists Institute. This year we worked with two artists who they have very good market share, I guess now you could say. Lucy McKenzie and Pierre Wieg. I just went to Pierre's show at Hauser and Wirth in London. This is multi-millions of dollars.
Well, then why are you showing someone like that?
Yeah, well, for a couple of reasons. I think the Artists Institute was very interesting to Pierre because he could do something there that wasn't even really art. We called nothing art, by the way. I mean, the bird was hatched, but this was all, in a way, an incubator for Pierre's practice. It enabled him in our little basement to get back probably to the size of his studio, maybe when he was 25. And we were also able, in a very, if what surrounds Pierre here in New York is Central Park, big budget, Marion Goodman Gallery, blue chip artist, when did someone sit down and think about this work? And we'd spend 6 months with each artist. So we really thought about that. And we did a lot of programs that I hope when people come back, and if they listen on our website to a talk that we had with a genetic engineer, in a year, when Pierre does something again, you'll know why we did that talk. And I hope that you'll see something very different in the work. And we also, as part of, maybe to your question, because the Artists Institute is a part of Hunter College and a part of a graduate program in fine art and art history. And we also have a seminar each semester that lasts 6 months that tracks with the season of the artist. So the students are contributing to our program, and in a way, yes, some of the artists that we've worked with have been more high profile, but we're spending 6 months with graduate students also using their work as an occasion for further research. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I hope that the context that I'm thinking about at the Artists Institute can really be generative for work in a way that isn't possible at a commercial gallery. They're generative in a whole other different way.
I think on a very basic sort of fundamental level, the difference ultimately is that at a nonprofit, in theory, the artist's work is not obligated to sell. That's the main difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit. course, it's not always the case. Often a participant, for instance, it's definitely not the case. If an artist sells a work, great. If not, nobody gives a shit. Like, we're not there, that's not the ultimate goal. Not saying that as part of the program, maybe you don't have to deal with the market in other ways. And I think if you look at global curating, there's a difference between American funding and European funding, obviously. And that'll breed a whole different kind of curator or artist, for instance. But in the States, at least, if you look at who our funders are, it's the same people that buy work at Gagosian, it's all very much implicated in the same system. I just feel like the end game, again, in theory, should be different. The artist should not be pressured to sell their work in a nonprofit space. And I have a question for you, Jovana, actually. I was wondering if there's a reason why there are no sort of for-profit people on this panel, because we're all nonprofit, right?
That's a very good question. We had a curator, and she's on the list, and she had a wonderful, actually, perspective, and we were supposed to talk about what you were mentioning, because she was invited to be a curator embedded in a commercial gallery, and and knowing her, she wouldn't do it like as a, lend her respectability so they can sell more when she curates fierce shows. So to answer your question, it's not like my blind spot.
No, I know. I just feel bad because we're all like, we're the nonprofit team, and fuck Chelsea,
But I think the difference, as everyone else has said, is what's the goal? And in a commercial space, the goal is sales, right? We have different goals, and I think what you said about providing artists with a space for contemplation, for a long-term engagement, is hugely important. Even artists who have multi-million-dollar careers, because they are a business. They are themselves a business by that point. And so to be able to step back, whether it's through a museum show or something at Artist Institute or ICI or Participant or whatever it is really valuable. But I also think, the other thing I always think about is that artists, this is their job, to be an artist. You're not, ideally, it's your only job. Maybe you teach as well, but you're not like a doctor who's also an artist, and you make all your money being a doctor. Your job is to be an artist, and so I do think that it's very important to think about where the sources of income are for people who have decided to do that with their life, and the way it currently exists, it's in galleries. And so there are, I know many galleries who are great, who are artists committed, who are there for artists to support them. So it isn't to say that there's a death match.
Galleries care for artists,
exactly.
by the way, for their entire careers.
Yes, exactly. They pay their bills, literally.
Really, in a way, the most dedicated people to artists' careers that are there. So it's not, I'm not talking about galleries, bad, nonprofit, good. I'm just saying, if you're a nonprofit, then what are the stakes for you, and what are your priorities?
There was a moment when I was working at this gallery, Rena Smalling's. It didn't pan out, but we had a very long discussion about getting health insurance for all of our artists. And this was also during Occupy, and it really kind of made everybody think about, artists don't have health insurance. That's so fucked up. And how, at a gallery, that could maybe be something that you could provide from an institutional level. Didn't happen.
Nice
We thought about it.
Okay, maybe one more question, if we have more questions. You are the last.
I think actually that something we should think about as we're all growing a little older after 33 is to start and build structures that would allow all of us, artists and curators and writers, to make a living. And maybe the solution is in hybrid institutions that act like nonprofits but make a living, like Arcadia Missa in London or like P here. And I'm wondering, how come none of you guys who are all, well, I guess a lot of you guys work in institutions, but have you thought about starting institutions and what that means in age-wise? Because you have to be dumb and stupid to start an institution, probably.
I mean, my position, I'll just talk about my position at ICI. I'm the executive director of exhibitions. And ICI is an organization that's been around since 1975, but in 2008, the organization was nearly going bankrupt. And we had a new executive director come on, and Kate Fowle, she's now curator at the Garage in Moscow, she completely reorganized and restructured the entire organization to think about what we were doing, was it relevant, how we were doing it. And that's exactly when I started working there. And so I kind of have this opportunity to work with an old history, but to work in an entirely new way. So I'm also, I know, very fortunate that I work for an organization that's extremely sympathetic, you know, to my criticisms, and that I really have the ability to kind of shape what we do as an institution. And I would say all of the people that work in my small office have the same kind of leverage. And so starting a new institution, I kind of feel like that's what I am doing in a way. So I have this old history, but this kind of new structure. So that's just my perspective.
Well, I want to know how Pi works, because I don't actually know. Can you speak?
P doesn't actually represent artists, but they produce the work and sell it. I don't know why I'm speaking for Prem, because I don't know more than this, but it is a hybrid model. The same with Arcadia Missa and Auto Italia in London. They also do stupid things that nonprofits do, like produce publications that would never make them money, but they sell and they make a living and they support their artists and they support themselves, and that seems important.
Shout out to Wage.
Yeah, I think these all sound great, and that I would love to start like a bar that then supported.
This is for the next generation of curators to really, you know, like to tackle.
We need to think through the bar.
I think
and the social club.
I like the social club, but I think the other answer is that there are people doing that, and it's amazing, and they should do it. But I think we don't all have to start new institutions. I think the old ones, not that all institutions should last forever, but there's value in also in kind of what you were saying about your process at ICI. I mean, the Brooklyn Museum is a very institution-y, quote unquote, institution. It's not always perfect. It's often frustrating. It's often very, very interesting to kind of see the tensions that are produced by a very long history that has nothing to do with living artists until all of a sudden it does. And now it really does. So to that question, I think people should absolutely start new institutions. And I am interested, I want to go, but I don't know that everybody needs to do that, and that it's okay. Because we need people doing things that are interesting in all of our institutions and all of our nonprofit spaces. Especially people who support artists and, you know, do that with their lives as well.
Okay, we are going to stop here and I'm thanking my panelists, wonderful panelists, and audience very much. And please, you know, follow us and come to other events that we are doing and support us. We are at the very beginning, so we're going to do even better in opening discussions and all you know, trying to solve all the injustice in the art world, starting now.
Part 2.
Part 2. Thank you again.